Have you ever wondered why some trees drop their leaves and some trees don't? Why some trees have needles, some have large lofty leaves, some have tiny leaves, and some have leaves that they keep all the time, they don't drop them at all? Hey y'all, Kyle here with the Native Habitat Project, and today is the first of many videos where we're gonna dive deeper into certain topics. Today, we're talking about leaves. At least that's where my ADHD brain is gonna start. Who knows where we're gonna end up by the end of this, but I wanted to make some longer format content for y'all, and this is one of our first attempts. So y'all stick around, let's get into it. So a couple days ago, I was watching another video by a fellow forester who was talking about evergreens like this eastern red cedar here and how they put so much energy into creating their leaves that they can't afford to drop them. I think it's the other way around. I think that they don't need to drop their leaves so they're able to put more energy into creating them. And what I mean by that is the non-deciduous trees around here, the evergreens that don't drop their leaves like cedars and hemlocks, they aren't fire tolerant. They grow in places where fire doesn't really exist. So they have really thin barks that can't withstand fire. If you run a fire through a bunch of cedars, you're probably gonna kill most of them, especially if they're young. If you run fire through hemlocks, which doesn't happen much because hemlocks grow in areas where fire isn't really prominent, north side slopes, hollers, deep ravines, it would probably kill them too. So they have thin barks and they're in ecosystems that don't have fire, so they don't drop their needles because they don't need to. Species that do drop their needles are usually in ecosystems, or needles or leaves are usually in ecosystems that have a lot of fire. So that's why they're dropping them in the fall, is because they want fire to be there. They want fire to be there so it keeps away species that aren't supposed to be there. And that's why when you take away fire in a lot of our savannas, you have a lot of cedars coming up. Fire would have been there naturally, keeping those cedars away. So check this out. This is a willow, and willow are bottomland species, and you can see their leaves right here. If they weren't damp right now, I'd light them, but these do not carry fire really well, and that's because they don't want fire. They're not fire tolerant. They grow in ecosystems where fire doesn't exist. But guess what? Species like this loblolly love fire. That's why they have thick bark, and that's why they put down this thick layer of duff on the ground that's really flammable. I burn this every year. This is just 1 year's worth of leaf litter from this loblolly. All right, so check this out. This is a water oak. Water oaks have really tiny leaves because they're bottomland species. They don't want fire. They don't grow in ecosystems that have a lot of fire. And they're almost semi-evergreen. They'll hold on to their leaves for a really, really long time. You can see leaves falling around me. Those are falling because they want fire in the fall and spring. These don't want fire. That's not part of their ecology. That's not what they're adapted to. So they hold on to their leaves. You can see these are still really green, while our upland hardwood species have already dropped all their leaves. And if you look, water oak and willow oak are really smooth. They have really smooth bark compared to other oak species. And check this out. These willow oaks lay so flat on the ground and compacted that fire can't move through here. They lay right up against the moisture of the ground because they don't want fire. Here's another great example of a tree species that doesn't like fire. This is sweet gum. Look at their leaves. These leaves, when they're dry, anyways, they're really damp this morning, they'll crumble into just powder. So, look at this. They'll just disappear, and all those crumbles fall to the soil because they don't want to stick around very long. They don't like fire. If you notice, those upland hardwood species that do like fire will stick around really long. Their leaves last a long time, sometimes years, and that's because they love fire. So these leaves right here belong to a blackjack oak. And right here next to it, we got a post oak. Post oaks have these cross-shaped leaves. If you notice, these are the logo for Native Habitat Project. And post oaks are probably one of my favorite oak species, but this is probably my favorite pine species. This is shortleaf pine. And shortleaves will drop their leaves, but they don't make... And shortleaves are also semi-deciduous conifers. They'll drop their leaves too, but they don't make that thick duff layer like longleaf and loblolly do. And that's why they grow with upland hardwood species. Look at all those leaves. These hardwood leaves right here act as the fuel to carry fire through here, because shortleaves make some flammable material, but not a whole lot. And the best way to tell a shortleaf from other pine species is it has short leaves, obviously, but it also has these resin pits. The bark looks really similar to loblolly, but it has these resin pits, and it has these spots on here that look like somebody just stabbed it with a pencil or a pen and made like a small divot right there. So really cool pine species, and grows with upland hardwoods, mostly post oaks and blackjacks. And I just love their canopies. Those little needles and tiny pine cones are super cool. But shortleaf, post oak, and blackjack are all indicator species of savanna. So if you see any of those trees in a forest, that forest was likely a savanna at one point and has been disturbed and has fire disappear from the landscape and has caused that forest to turn into a forest that's not supposed to be there. So indicator species like shortleaf and post oak and blackjack, keep an eye out for them when you're managing a property, and they'll tell you what that place wants to be. So we're back over here at this blackjack oak, and a couple weeks ago we were at the Eastern Native Grasslands Symposium, and John Seymour from Roundstone Native Seeds had a blackjack that fell down on his property, so he cut it up and he used those slabs for decoration on the tables at dinner every night. And there was a blackjack half this size, and it was 160 years old, just really, really old. So this tree right here could easily be 200 plus years old. And so looking for these really old trees in a forest tells you what that forest used to be, because these trees have been here for a really long time. The maples and beech and sweet gums, those fast growing trees, might have showed up 100 years after this one started growing. And the reason that they're there now and mature is because fire was removed, and they've grown a lot over the past 100 years. But anyways, let's get back to leaves. You see these leaves? All these upland hardwood leaves are just really lofty. They stay off the ground, they curl up, so they allow a lot of air in between those layers of leaves. They stay off the moist ground, and that's what helps fire carry through an area. So these leaves burn a lot better than those tiny leaves of bottomland oak species, or willows, or cedars that don't even drop leaves, or beech that hang onto their leaves all year long pretty much. And that's what we're looking at right here. If you notice, beeches, they hold on to their leaves through winter. You see those brown leaves hanging on to their limbs. They're starting to turn brown now a little bit, but these trees hold on to their leaves because they don't need to drop leaves to create fire. And that's why they're fire intolerant. They don't like fire. They have a really thin bark. I mean, check this out. Super thin, smooth barks do not hold up well to fire. Hardwood oak species, or upland oak species, have really thick barks that hold up well to fire. For example, thick bark, really resistant to fire. Like loblollies or pine species have thick barks, so do these upland hardwoods. So all that leaf litter I showed you a minute ago is all in somebody's front yard, and this is next to their front yard. This is an area that they mow only once a year, and the mowing has replicated what fire does in some ways by keeping away undesirable species where they can mow at least. And so it's also allowed wildflowers to be here, like this the showy goldenrod. We got some of this I believe this is elm leaf goldenrod. We got just tons and tons of these wood oats. If you see wood oats in an area, they're also an indicator that an area wants to be a savanna. But mix in here with these wood oats, if I can find it. I'm looking. All right, well, here's one I flagged. This is a grass leaf prairie aster. Really cool species, also wants to be in a savanna. But you can see all this diversity is out here on the edge of this savanna where it's still getting a lot of sunlight. But as we come in here where the savanna is a little bit more closed, could probably use a few trees cut down. You can see there's not as much diversity in here. You still have a lot of wood oats because they can handle the shade, but not a whole lot of diversity. All right, so let's look in between these large hardwoods and shortleaves. We've got lots of bottomland oak species coming up, like willow oak and water oak. We also have a bunch of maples and beech popping up in here, and that's because those aren't fire tolerant species. They don't like fire. And so if we did bring fire back to this area, it would kill those species. So that's why these trees are dropping flammable leaves. That's why they have thick bark, because they want fire, and that fire plays a role. It weeds out their competition, the things that aren't supposed to be there, like the bottomland hardwood species, or the species that are supposed to be growing down in a holler or on a north facing slope. Those species shouldn't be on a south facing slope. Those species shouldn't be in a prairie or in a savanna. And so that fire is what's going to keep those species away from there. So if you want to keep a plant community intact, like upland savannas, if you have 200-year-old trees here, if you have shortleaf and post oak and blackjack, it's your obligation to keep fire in those communities, in those plant communities, to keep them healthy and to keep the things there that are supposed to be there and keep out the things that aren't supposed to be there. But that's my rant today. We covered a lot, but if you ran a fire through here right now, maybe not this morning because there's a lot of dew on the ground, it would burn like crazy. It's gonna burn pretty hot, so we'd burn it on a cool day first time because there's probably a lot of duff and a lot of things built up in here. But that's my rant. If you look at leaves, they'll tell you a lot, especially if they like fire or if they don't like fire.